Hi, I'm Chris Sharp. I'm the coordinator for the Adventure Therapies program here at Sierra Tucson. Just by way of background, the clients here at Sierra Tucson get to participate in experiential therapy at least once a week during their treatment here. It typically alternates between equine therapy and adventure therapy, as well as additional programming as is advocated by their primary treatment, the primary therapist and their treatment team. So this is something that's an integral part of our therapeutic process here, and allows our clients to have a wide range of experience and integrating this process of adventure therapy into their overall recovery and treatment. What I'd like to do today is really just talk about some of the underpinnings and basic understandings in adventure therapy. And you know, this is the first time I'm doing one of these, so I'm not entirely sure who my audience is. By all means, please ask questions for clarification, and maybe I can come back and address those at the end, or create a second one of these trainings for folks as it goes forward. So let me start. Why don't I turn off my cam and just show you the PowerPoint as I go forward. Right. So many people associate the idea of adventure therapy with ropes courses, zip lines, and mountaineering trips. And while that's often the setting, that's not really what it's about at the core. This statement here, new experiences, real or imagined, create new schema and possibility, is really the essence of what adventure therapy means to me. And the idea here is that it's a holistic process that engages the client in the whole process and allows them to immerse themselves in the treatment and care process. So really thinking that this is an opportunity to just share a couple of the, I don't know, the basic ideas and definition here. And maybe I can give you guys some examples of how I facilitate or enable some of this treatment process going forward. So the origins of adventure therapy are within the experiential education model. And this is a movement and field that has been developing for quite some time and kind of has culminated in our current understanding of adventure therapy. So to understand, experiential education is not adventure therapy, but nonetheless, it is both the kind of programmatic and theoretical basis for a lot of what we do here. Experiential education is really the combination of the models of progressive education as defined and kind of pioneered by John Dewey, the progressive educator. There's redundancy for you. Basically, the model being that the learner is a participant, and more can be learned by struggling with a problem than by being provided with a solution. Combining that very much with the education philosophies of Paulo Freire and pedagogy of the oppressed, that idea that it's participant-based, that the participant is an integral part of the process, and you know, that model of the empty vessel, that a client, a student, is not an empty vessel, but rather comes with their own experience, and to be aware of that, to include that, to consciously connect to that is an essential tool for effective education. We can't just lecture at people and expect them to take that on board. This kind of comes together under the vision of Kurt Hahn, a progressive educator in the early part of World War II, who came up with a model titled at some point Journey, Expedition, and Challenge. And a lot of people know it today as Outward Bound, the school that he formed. The Journey, Expedition, and Challenge model is both the kind of directive for how to facilitate, as well as the imagery or metaphor that's in the process. To understand Kurt Hahn's model, it involved a number of components, including the conscious use of metaphor, which is essential for what we do in adventure therapy, because very few of us have a need to go high up on telephone poles or climb mountains or hike in the desert as part of their regular practice, but rather there can be lessons learned in that process that can be transferred to our real life. The experience-centered but also value-centered concept here is the idea that it is a participatory process, that one has to participate at some level, engage in the process in order to derive the values inherent to that learning. So that is, it is not a passive process. It's an experience-based one. And critical to this model is the idea of risk and stress as prerequisites for growth. This includes both that idea of use stress, healthy stress used to motivate and activate individuals, as well as a perception of risk and stress in our lives, and that this is a tool for understanding, processing, and existing within a world that exists with risk and stress. The philosophy of experiential education specifically highlights the use of natural and logical consequences to provide feedback to the learner and incorporates reflection on the experience as a critical component of the learning process. This is the modern understanding of adventure therapy as defined by theorists like Glass and Alvarez, researchers in the field of adventure therapy. So what does that mean in practice for us? Well, adventure therapy is built from and rooted in experiential education, but is a clinical field in the mental health practice. It's not education, it's not recreation, in its direct goals and outcomes. I understand that both recreation and education can have therapeutic effects and beneficial outcomes, but they're not a form of clinical practice. Adventure therapy is considered clinical treatment within the behavioral health field because it incorporates problem identification, specific targeted outcomes, the use of specific interventions, and of course it's facilitated by clinically trained professionals. Or to say it another way, it's differentially applied treatment based on clinical diagnosis and intended outcomes. So it could be something like if you have clients with mood or depressive issues, that you're specifically targeting an activity towards an understanding of goal setting and allowing an individual to become activated and set goals and then follow through with those in a little microcosm, if you will, with attainable goals, with a finite endpoint and real tools in their possession that they can use to accomplish that. It isn't merely throwing people on a ropes course or out on a hike and seeing what comes up organically for them, but rather is directing that process. So the definition here from Gass and Gillis is something that I'm going to try and break down the different components of, but understand that involving all these components of kinesthetic as well as behavioral understandings and impacts in this. So there's a number of different kind of visual models that we can use in understanding the process for adventure therapy. This one, the Kolb cycle, is a good one because it's relatively simplistic and it shows one of the processes that we go through. Understand that this can be repeated as many times as necessary to get the desired output. So the idea here of the what, so what, now what is more or less our organic structure. It starts with a plan where the client is introduced to what is intended to be accomplished in the activity, what are the restrictions, tools, and what are the potential risks and outcomes in the process. The client then engages in the process or does the process. They're then asked to reflect on what happened, what they were aware of, what was important to them. And then the now what section, what can we carry over from this experience onto the next? So in a simple example of crossing a wire bridge or an elevated platform kind of thing, they're told what to expect. They're asked to define what their boundaries are. They then engage in the process. They then come back down from that elevated platform or that traverse on a cable or something along those lines, and are asked to share what's been going on, what they perceived, and what was a challenge or reward for them. And then they're asked to synthesize from that what can carry on to the next process. And this can be repeated multiple times in the course of a single adventure therapy program, or it can be repeated through multiple applications of adventure therapy so that we can build on the learning process, the experiential, as well as other growth that's been going on for the client. So want to highlight this kinesthetic component, the idea that we are engaging in a multi-sensory process, that they are literally in the space. It means getting up off the couch, so to speak. This is critically important because there's so many inputs that the client is able to perceive and interact with, that it allows the facilitator to highlight, activate, or remove activation based on what is part of the environment and what is part of the process there. So again, we talked about the idea of ropes courses and adventure programs, but this can also be conducted within, you know, a limited space, a therapy group room, or a phone booth, if you will, because these are all tools that we have that we can apply to different clients as we consider it to be necessary, but the idea that they are actively engaging in it. So kinesthetic for most people means movement, but I think we should understand that it doesn't have to involve movement, it involves the engagement process there. All levels and kind of a continuum there. It allows us to bypass some of the client's narrative because it's real-time action, so it's not about bringing up the past story and repeating the trauma history in the group setting, but rather it's about what's showing up organically and inherent to how they're feeling that day or similar. So this is the point that I want to make about adventure therapy being different from, say, adventure education or physical fitness or something along those lines, is that it very specifically targets therapeutic goals, and that within the process of each client, you're looking at their therapeutic goals, you're looking at their diagnosis, you're looking at their activation trigger history, that sort of thing, to allow you to facilitate something that has a specific intended therapeutic outcome. So for example, an activity that I like a great deal is a challenge wall, which is a freestanding 12-foot wall that I have one of here and I've used it multiple places. And this is a challenge that requires a group to figure out how to get the entire group up and over this freestanding wall without external resources. And so obviously it requires some problem solving to think about how you're going to get the first person up that wall without anybody on the top of the wall to help them, and how you're going to get the last person up and over without anybody on the ground to support them. And naturally, organically, this is going to require communication, trust, cooperation, great kind of learning tools. But I think specifically, as a therapist, we can focus on, say, the client's functionality and efficacy in how they interacted with a peer. And you have both the real-time experience, so they're not reflecting deep into their past about something that didn't work out or did work out for them, but rather drawing on something that is mere seconds or minutes before. And also as a therapist, we have that opportunity for firsthand observation. And that's essential for us to differentiate the client's internal and external communication modalities there. So what story are they telling themselves? What story are they telling us? And so this is an incredibly powerful therapeutic tool in the overall treatment. A couple more walls of text for you here. The dynamic therapist-client relationship, because we are so active in the intentionality of how they perceive the environment, both social and physical, there has to be a dynamic process there of give and take, communicating and interpreting and understanding how they're taking that piece on. This is really essential for that trauma-informed understanding, because whereas this actively involves perceived risk and some challenge, that is kind of the intention of adventure therapy, it also allows us to communicate and understand and engage that that awareness of perceived risk and of discomfort and challenge and that sort of thing. It allows us to be dynamic in that structure. Finally, or not finally, I guess, but the last thing on this page, therapist is intentional in the facilitation process. So there is a lot of thought that goes into how things are sequenced. Sequencing is kind of the core of the facilitator's skill set in what comes before and what comes after. How do you build on communication, trust, understanding in order to create the peak outcome. You can't just jump straight into flying down a zip line if you want to have some therapeutic outcomes. That's fine for a recreational opportunity because you step off the platform and everything's out of your hands. But in a therapeutic context, there has to be building up both for the understanding of trust and connection there, but also in the what's going to be able to be transferred. Because if one is in that fight or flight mode throughout the process, there's no opportunity for learning. So the therapist has to be intentional in titrating the stress and discomfort and the support and communication piece there. So the final component that I want to throw out here is this idea of the healing power of nature. And this is something that I would like to talk more about. Maybe this context isn't quite enough, and I know my colleague Kevin gave a nourishment webinar about some of the aspects of healing power of nature, but this is a dynamic component in the overall adventure therapy. Often nature is an additional facilitator in the process. I have the opportunity to work here in the Sonoran Desert, which is an incredibly charismatic landscape that with prickly barbs and overt defensive mechanisms for all of our flora and fauna certainly allows an intense awareness and focus. Hopefully I can facilitate that to a level of mindfulness. But concepts of biophilia, the healing power of nature, is super important there. And something that we like to identify, connect with, and use as much as possible. Understand too, though, that the built environment works for us as well. Indoors, manufactured resources like climbing walls and ropes courses. These are not natural environments, but they're part of our awareness and something that we adapt and account for in the overall process. I think this comes back to this basic understanding that we have to have in kind of a trauma-informed treatment model, in that if the level of arousal for the client is low, they're generally uninterested and unmotivated. If the level of arousal is too high, they can be anxious, hypervigilant, unable to focus. But by adapting both the use of environment as well as the awareness of that environment, that multi-sensorial stimulus allows the adventure therapist to directly influence the level of arousal for the client and allows them to be specific in targeting the neural network for the client. So to kind of recap the process here, or to share kind of how facilitation works, what we're talking about here are some underlying components that are essential for the adventure therapy to both be effective and to differentiate from other modalities. So there's the trustworthy and transparent component. In facilitation, this is often called the full value contract or a challenge by choice model. And this is the idea that throughout this process, the therapist is not ambushing the client with a surprise or unexpected expectation, environment, or requirement kind of thing. That in the beginning of each of these activities, we start with a process by which clients define their perceived boundaries and receive support in understanding that, as well as defining some of the expectations, both as far as participation and as far as risk and how they can negotiate that risk. Next, we get into this negotiated risk and stress process. That is something that is dynamic in the processing, and so it changes. And the client has to be updated on what the perceived risk is there and what they can do to step into it and engage it, or to set healthy boundaries in that overall process. The use of natural and logical consequences is fundamental in the experiential education model. And so it's this idea of intrinsic rewards. We don't give you a t-shirt or a bandana for having completed an activity, and certainly not focusing on who's fastest or who's most creative, but rather that idea of what's your internal reward process? What have you identified as being of value in this process, and allow that to speak most strongly in the process. Experiential learning, this seems pretty clear cut to me, but I want to be clear that the idea of experiential learning can again exist on a spectrum. So it does not have to be a person jumping up, running around, doing something intensely physical. Engagement happens on a whole bunch of different levels. And there's a bunch of different activities that can engage different levels of both physical and emotional coherence. And so the experiential learning piece there is that they are in the midst of it. It's not, I mean, this is the perfect example of what it's not. It's not a lecture on a Zoom call telling you and showing you PowerPoints. It's actually engaging in that process. Recognizing that you're part of the place you're in, and that you have power and agency in that space. So I think that's the bulk of what I wanted to go over here today. Let's see. So just a little bit of backdrop here, and maybe I'll pull up my camera so I can answer some questions here. What kind of questions have people put up for me? Can you speak to the use of serenity in beautiful environments that folks from the city may not be used to, but are finding to be a welcome reprieve from the typical busy life? There's been challenges to the adventure environment. I've noticed that some clients I've worked with in these atmospheres have highlighted and welcomed the difference in their regular lives. Yeah, so beyond the scope of this meeting, but the idea of the natural environment is, like I said, very much an additional facilitator in our overall process. Understanding the impact that both natural environments and beauty, serenity have on the client is a tool that is incredible for helping to modulate what level of activation the client is at. It's really empowering to see how just a few moments in the Sonoran Desert where I'm in, or in some of the other natural environments that I've worked in, how that can impact the level of self-regulation. So spending time in nature has multiple systemic benefits. And you know, if you look at the work on biophilia and forest bathing and some of the other modules out there, you'll understand that it is an absolute tool that can be placed within your toolkit. One of the things I want to be aware of is there tends to be a impact awareness that if you're an urban dweller, it doesn't take a very remote setting in order to engage some of this calming and beneficial effects. But you may need to kind of up the level of remoteness as one has more experience being in a rural or even a very remote setting. So if I'm a city dweller, going to Central Park can have a great impact on my well-being and the like. But if I'm a rural person, I'm probably going to still see all the people and all the movement around there. I don't know, I hope that answers some of that, but I want to say that it is absolutely a tool that we use in the overall process. So I've got a question here. How does mobility and age impact adventure therapy? modalities. So infinitely adaptable. If we look at these underpinnings here, we see that that this sort of philosophy can be applied to things that are relatively low mobility. A lot of the activities I do are, from the group room indoor setting where one can use something that engages this process. So it has to have engagement, it has to have participation, it has to have their opportunity to explore what's going on internally, and then the opportunity for them to process it externally. So there's the idea that when I have groups that I deal a lot with pain groups, tend not to think of them as having the mobility to go out to a ropes course and the like. Nonetheless, rhythmic movement and active low impact movement can be incredibly validating and empowering for these clients. And the idea that I haven't done something like this since I was a kid is something that I regularly hear, and it goes along with an elevation in mood and an opportunity for you to capitalize on that and see what of value can come out of that recognition. So, mobility and age aren't restrictions, but they certainly fit into the thinking of how one facilitates or sequences the process. What else can I do here? How does one get started offering this type of therapy? What specific behavior changes do you see in folks when they are participating in these type of activities? Thanks for that one. The idea of adventure therapy often being supportive and supplemental in the overall behavioral health, behavioral treatment piece is something that I've been living in and operating in for a long time. I want you to be aware that, in particular, like the VA includes experiential therapy as an essential treatment modality for their clientele. And so it's not just an ancillary or supportive piece, but rather can be a critical component and focus for a number of different diseases and treatment modalities. So specific behavior changes that we see in folks when they're participating in these types of activities. So I love doing this because I literally play games with people for a living. And almost always it starts with reluctance, anxiety, elements of fear. And then it is my facilitation and the process inherent to movement, activity, engagement that almost always results in an increase in or an improvement in mood and a increase in coherence, that people are able to become much more connected with the here and now, be present overall. In particular, that idea of getting out of one's head and into one's body, it maybe is a cliche, but it really does show up. And so much of what I get to do is, asking people, so you enabled this process, you changed from that anxious, fear, anger-based, core feelings into a space of joy, connection, coherence. What did you do that allowed you to be there? And they can probably go, well, I played a game. But it often comes down to a critical understanding of what engagement does for them. We spend so much of our lives trying to filter information and disengage that idea of allowing people to actively engage, because it has set parameters. It has a limitation on time, a limitation on the goal, final completion kind of thing. It can create a lot of coherence for clientele. Hope that gets to it. Top recommendation for a resource, i.e. books and training. Great question. There are a number of resources out there. Oops, I guess that's my last. Oh, here we go. Yeah, here's some resources. Maybe this will show up there. There's a number of organizations out there. Outward Bound, of course, is a powerful organization in what it does in training. The AEE, the Association for Experiential Education, is the clearinghouse for experiential education, but also experiential therapy trainings and modality. Current text that I'm using, I can send this out with the notes, is Adventure Group Psychotherapy by Alvarez et al. Definitely an updated version. You saw some quotes early on with Michael Gass's book, Adventure Therapy. It's probably on its 5th or 6th edition, but I think the Adventure Group Psychotherapy is the best current text that I have for the field. If in the initial stages a client is not engaged or able to open themselves up to treatment, is it an acceptable option to engage them in recreational activities therapeutic to similar one as a way to get their toes wet? Yes and no. That's what it's going to look like in my experience. And I think that we can trick people in some ways to engage in therapy by starting it off with a game. This idea of sequencing and how we can add difficulty, add complexity, add engagement as we go along means that you often want to start with something that just is there to reduce their reluctance to that modality. A game in the form of a warm-up, an energizer, an introduction can really help set the container and help set the understanding. So the idea of getting their toes wet, absolutely. I think that's a appropriate analogy. The idea of that's a switch in directions. I think that's the intention. I think we have to use a titrated sequence in order to get people to the final kind of peak experience there. And the cold cycle there that I showed is one example of how we process the programming. A lot of the education models and training go with more of a wave function, the idea that you keep building on previous experiences, so that you start with a low engagement game, and then you build to something that has more cognitive connection, and you complete with something that has something much more kinesthetic and integrative. And with each one of those, you're building trust, you're building efficacy, and you're building understanding. So I think we're about out of time here. So thank you all very much. I think I'm going to complete here, and we will send out the PowerPoint in order to allow folks to take a look there and pull up any of the resources there. Thanks very much.